And hence the process of urbanization is a very, very complicated and a very, very multidimensional process. Not only does it take time to happen, but it also impacts human beings in more ways than one. Economically, infrastructurally, socially, psychologically, culturally, in terms of health, in terms of environment, in every way. Hence, we can say that urbanization involves cultural change, political administrative changes within the country, economic, geographical, and many sub and smaller processes associated with this. Now, the process of urbanization therefore also includes a kind of culture assimilation. It is a top to bottom process. To begin with, globalization impacts the urban culture, for example, of Indian society. From here, it goes into rural India and further expands towards the more remote areas. In a way, we are talking about culture diffusion, the spread of ideas, lifestyles, norms, values from one area to another. So it always flows from a more sophisticated society to a less sophisticated society. Always remember that culture will always flow in a pattern from where the more complex society will definitely impact the less complex society. And hence, we can also see that there is a new kind of material culture, which means new roads, new artifacts, new forms of art, literature, new forms of metro trains, new forms of aeroplanes, new forms of computers and mobiles, which is something that is physical assets and non material culture. Alongside this cultural diffusion, there is a corresponding change in culture, religious orientation, family values, your norms, plus your folk ways. The way people live their lives on a day to day basis, everything gets changed. Now, Indian society, whenever we talk about, we know that India has been a very hospitable society. From the beginning, like after the later Vedic society, constantly society has been impacted by foreign invasions. To begin with, we had people coming from the northwest. We had races like Indo-Greeks, Shakas, Kushans. Of course, before that, we had the Aryan culture expansion. After that, we had a lot of Islamic dynasties coming inside. All of them did one thing. They came and they settled here in India, creating Indian society in such a way that it became a cultural hotpot. It became a cultural mix of various originally discrete cultures. So today we say that Indian society is nothing but a result of assimilation of various cultures. Plus, it is also a very, very syncretic society, as I had told you before. Syncretism means the ability to absorb all the various changes that you are experiencing. I always tell that Indian society is like Scotch Brite in a very funny sense. Scotch Brite is a sponge which absorbs all the water. Normally, it's used to clean utensils. Similarly, Indian society is that sponge or that Scotch Brite which has never broken apart. It kept on absorbing. A sponge also doesn't break. It keeps on swelling and expanding as you put more water into it. Similarly, Indian society has been a place where diverse cultures have been coming inside. With them, diverse religions, diverse languages, diverse way of eating, wearing clothes, interaction, diverse ways of professions and occupations, art and architecture have come. But it has only made Indian culture more motley, which means more diverse, more heterogeneous, more composite, more plural, instead of breaking it down. And hence, Indian society is very syncretic. It has the capacity to absorb and change, but it doesn't break down. That's the beauty of our society. And hence, today we can say the urbanization that we are experiencing, again, it is not a standalone thing. It did not happen automatically in the 21st century. It is again a legacy that has come down to us since the 600 BC period. And we can also say that today Indian society experiences a motley, myriad, diverse, heterogeneous, composite kind of culture. Why? Because we are a syncretic society. We have absorbed all the impacts that we have experienced. So India has had a very long and an ongoing history of urbanization in the real sense. We have accepted foreign influences. We have developed cross-cultural ideologies. We have certain religious places as well as highly commercialized cities as well. And not only because of the influence of the Aryan Indian culture, but also massively because of the influence of Persian culture. A very good example could be the North Indian classical music. Now, classical music in India is also two kinds. The pure Indian classical music is the Carnatic music that is existing in the southern part of India. M.S. Subbulakshmi, the doyen of classical music, the first musician to get Bharat Ratna award in India. Similarly, in the north part of the India, you have the Hindustani classical music, Ghazal, Thumri, all those versions. Now, this Hindustani classical music is also Indian music, but it's not pure Indian music. We know why. Because again, it's a result of culture assimilation. It was a blend between Indian music and Persian music. Similarly, you can talk about the Gandhara school of art. You can talk about the Indo-Islamic or the Indo-Greek school of architecture. Now, look at institutions like the Gateway of India. Look at our parliament architecture. Now, all these are not purely Indian. They are a complete mix and match between diverse styles of art languages. Similarly, look at the language Hindi as we use it today. Again, it's a blend between some Urdu, some Punjabi, some words from English, and some Sanskrit. Similarly, people say even Urdu was an amalgamation between the Persian languages and some Arabic element and the local Indian languages existing at that time. So we know that from food itself, the fact that biryani was a very, very foreign concept to Indian soil, but today it is also one of the most famous cuisines of India. Similarly, you can talk about the textile as well, the Ajrak style of textile. You can talk about the Ikat style of textile. Now, all these are a mix and match between various diverse cultures. So, what is culture? Culture is this only: music, art, architecture, what we're talking about, food, language, textile. So, we know that today Indian culture is absolutely diverse. Again, because it is a product of culture assimilation. It is even reflected in the names of Indian cities. For example, Hyderabad, a very fine blend between Islamic and the traditional Hindu cultures. Similarly, Ghaziabad. Now, all these are very Persianized names. At the same time, they also offer unique sides of culture mix. And that's the beauty of Indian culture. So we cannot say that our urbanization is a new concept. Obviously, it is a very, very old legacy. Now, a lot of people associate urbanization with westernization. People say that urbanization means the same thing like westernization, and ultimately they both together make up modernization. But a sociology student will never agree and should not agree because we know that they are very different concepts. While modernization only means sophistication, do believe and always remember whenever you listen to the word modernization, it is only about sophistication. When things become more complicated, we say they are becoming modernized. At the same time, westernization is a completely different ideology. As I said in the previous chapter, westernization is only about being influenced and being impacted by Western culture. It's like becoming a copycat. When you like somebody, when you find somebody very attractive and awesome, you start copying them. They inspire you, your role models. Similarly, when you believe that your role model is Western countries, you become very Western. When you would say that I want to listen to more Western music and I do not really admire Indian folk and classical music so much, or Hindi music. When you believe that I like foreign food, I don't like the typical Indian traditional food. So, what are you trying to say? You are trying to say that you are highly impacted by a culture that is not Indian, and this is westernization. Now, according to M.N. Srinivas, the very famous sociologist who has given you the concept of not only westernization but also secularization, Sanskritization, all these famous ideologies. Now, he believes westernization to be a result of British rule in India. He says it brought about multiple changes at every level, not only technology, not only rural to urban migration, not only change of family, language, clothing, food, but at every level, Westerners impacted us. They changed us completely, and that is westernization. But it is not necessarily like modernization. When we copy somebody, maybe we will not end up well. For example, in the process of being Western, India also inherited or India also developed diseases like diabetes, hypertension, and depression. Today, the massive increase in divorce rates. Today, the massive spike in lifestyle diseases becoming the heart capital of the world. Where is all this coming from, really? We know that it is not something that is attributed to the traditional Indian food and culture and lifestyle. It's primarily owing to westernization. urbanization, because then we also copy the wrong elements like fast food and the junk culture. So what is happening? Westernization is not obviously in a positive sense. In fact, it could be in a very positive sometimes and sometimes also in a very negative sense. It's a very value neutral word. Hence, it is not about sophistication, unlike modernization. So, Indian society was also hugely impacted by Western culture. We know that. So, it is these Britishers also who, in a way, contributed big time to our urbanization. Now, how? Because they were the ones who laid down foundations of railways and telegraphs and postals. What happened as a result of that? As a result of that, when you have a better means of transportation and communication, you will naturally leave your village and go to the city for a better job. Plus, these people are also creating some industries and factories. Again, what is happening? Not only are they setting up factories and encouraging people from rural India to come and work there, they are also enabling them to do that by creating better roads and better railways. And hence, the process of rural to urban migration was in a way also initiated by the British people. Similarly, primary urbanization happens when small cities or major cities starts getting created. For example, British, in order to take away Indian raw material and in order to fill Indian markets with Britain-made products, created coastal cities of Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. So what happened? These became the primary urban centers. They were the first ones to become urban. When from here urbanization spreads to other cities, like I told you, it always comes from a more complex place to a less complex place. I also told you from west it will come to urban India first. From urban India it will come to rural India, and then slowly it will keep on going to smaller clusters. Right? That's how it goes. So similarly, what happens? Primary urbanization is when few cities are urbanized because of industrialization. From these primary cities, urban value starts spreading because of rural urban migration, because of rural urban contiguum, because of peri-urbanization, because of over-urbanization, because of suburbanization. The values will spread downwards in a top-to-down scenario. And hence we have the secondary urbanization that takes place. Now the process of urbanization, as we have spoken so far, is not just about changes of economic nature and changes of socio-cultural nature. It is also big time the changes of political nature. Now kindly remember the words of Weber, Max Weber, the classical sociologist who speaks about rationality and bureaucratization. What does Weber say? Or what has he said? He said that eventually all societies will be dominated by bureaucracy. Plus, all of them will be governed by an iron cage. What kind of iron cage will this be? The iron cage of bureaucracy and the iron cage of rationality, which means a logic, thinking, and scientific temper. And it will become so important that people cannot escape from it. Society will be organized strictly according to certain rules, and that is what is happening today, really. So, which means in the political aspect also, we see administrative changes coming from urbanization. We know that at the time of Mauryan Empire also we had certain small urban areas where people were doing small professions of manufacturing and artisanship in karkhanas. Similarly, after the Mughal period also we had cities. In India you had very flourishing cities which were creating good manufactured products. Simple manufacturing process by hand, artisans, handicraft, we had a very good export value too. We were a leading exporter of these things. And certain examples could be the Patliputra, Delhi, Madurai, Golconda. Now, all these were nice industrial and urban centers. But at that point of time, it was the kings or the dynasties which were deciding the nature of urban growth. However, much later, after the British industrialization took place, it was the money and the economic activity, the commercial activity, which started dictating the pattern of urbanization, that where cities will form. Now, old cities were constantly being created, they were constantly being finished. But after the advent of British, they completely finished. We know that they led to a deindustrialization of Indian society. Now, talking of economic progress or how to measure whether an area is really urban or it is still very urban, a very important indicator here happens to be economic process. Now, if urban areas are seeds of industrial growth, manufacturing, service enterprises, naturally the economic growth is very high. No wonder they attract people from all over the country to come and work there and settle there eventually. In fact, cities are grown. Cities are created on the premise of economic growth. They become the nerve centers. They become the generators of GDP and national income. No wonder they become larger and they have better infrastructure. The government also wants to invest there. For example, in most of the mega cities today, you have the special economic zone, specifically in the Silicon Valley of Hyderabad and Bengaluru. Why? Because the government has heavily invested. The government knows it is from this place that maximum income can be generated. And hence, economic growth is a very important aspect of urbanization as well. So, the level and nature of economic activity decides how and in which direction shall urbanization proceed. Now, as a geographical process, we talk about increasing population and rural to urban migration. Sometimes we talk about things like circular migration. Circular migration is the scenario where people migrate but not permanently. For example, on a daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis, or on an annual basis. Like the sugarcane cultivators of India, the women laborers who work in the sugarcane fields for harvesting during the peak season, they migrate from one area to another wherever the demand comes. So just like labor, many IT employees also migrate. Sometimes they operate from home, sometimes from abroad, sometimes from a city, sometimes from another city. But when you go out and then come back to your own place of residence, after a period of time, you are a circular migrant. So this also determines the nature of urbanization. Generally, urban centers experience a very high degree of circular immigration. A lot of people come here as circular migrants for job, essentially. So geographically, there is always an increase in population of a region which is urban. The density, as I said, will always grow. There is a heavy migration from rural to urban. There is a heavy migration from international to domestic. There is a heavy circular immigration. At the same time, metropolitization. Cities eventually do become metropolitans. They become very, very infrastructurally advanced. There is also a much better social infrastructure here. I have already mentioned social infrastructure always means education, health, and sanitation. So never confuse between infrastructure and social infrastructure. Never confuse between capital and social capital. Generally, it means the same. Then, over urbanization and suburbanization are also side effects of geographical aspect of urbanization. Hence, when we talk about the theories related with urbanization, different sociologists have chosen to define them in a different way. For example, if we talk about Theodorsson in 1969, he says urbanism is a pattern of culture and that kind of social interaction which happens when too many people or a lot of population settles in a very, very small area, which means the density of that population is very high, which means the people are very jam packed and compact together. Since these many people from different areas come and settle in a small region, the nature of interaction changes completely. Why? Because they are enjoying a very high level of technology. Maybe they are interacting with each other with only through social media or only through ICT. They are heavy users of IoT, Internet of Things. They are heavy users of smart technology. Plus, they are enjoying a very high degree of, I have always told you, modernization and urbanization are always about sophistication, complexity. They enjoy a very high degree of complexity in life. In terms of occupation, it's super specialized work that they are doing. Similarly, they are very mobile people, not only physically but also positionally. They can travel anywhere in the world. At the same time, their position in society is also very mobile. The more money they acquire, the more elite segment they will go and belong to. Unless they experience a loss or they experience some kind of accidental loss of money, then they will become the lower class. Unless that happens and until they keep on acquiring more skills and money, they will keep on proceeding to become the elite of society. They are very economically interdependent upon each other. You can close your eyes and say, when people are economically dependent upon each other, they enjoy Imal organic solidarity. Similarly, they do have relations with each other, but these are generally very, very impersonal relations or very, very formal relations. They are not very fluid and they are not very associative relations which they make. Now, talking about another theorist, Louis Wirth. What does Louis Wirth say? He says that urbanization is that complex process which happens because of a mix of these three factors, which are the combination of physical structure, social organization, and the corresponding change in attitudes of people. In terms of physical structure, we can talk about increasing population, and the same population is a heavy user of technology. Similarly, ecological degradation that's happening. At the same time, ecological awareness that's coming. All these various aspects belong to the physical structure. You can definitely talk about material culture here. Similarly, system of social organization from rural to urban, the characteristic of urbanism, that mentality of becoming urbanized is a loss of kinship relationships. People believe less in their family relations, relatives, but people give more importance to professional relationships. They give more importance to work ethics rather than family ethics. Similarly, people are now enjoying a better interaction with people who are their secondary contacts, whom they do not know personally, but they have to talk to them for living, for working. Similarly, social institutions change. Family, caste, gender, marriage, everything undergoes a change. At the same time, people's ideas and personalities also undergo a change. They become more individualistic. They become more commercial materialistic. They become more differentiated, where everybody has having a unique personality of their own, which is not determined by the culture of the place. It is unique in their likes, dislikes, preferences, ambitions, and aspirations. Now, the ecological approach is also very prominent in urbanization, and this has been given to us by thinkers such as Robert Park, Ernest Burgess, and Amos Howley. What do they say really? They say that the growth of cities does not only happen because of technology or because of industry. Neither does it happen on its own. It happens only as a result of environmental factors. Now, if you have read NCRT Geography of class 10th, you must be aware clearly the book tells you that the distribution of Indian population is determined by natural resources. If you have read 11th grade sociology book, NCRT again, it again says the distribution of Indian population from north to south, east to west in Indian territory is completely dependent upon the distribution of natural resources and geographical features. For example, wherever you have the alluvial plains, the north alluvial plains, the deltas of Indus, Ganga, and Brahmaputra, you have the alluvium soil. It's very fertile, so high prospects of agriculture. Many people will settle there. The population will be heavy there. Density will be very high. Similarly, if you talk about the black soil region, the soil region of Maharashtra, Gujarat, and the Malwa Plateau and all, again the population will be very high. Because it's again fertile, it leads to commercial agriculture of cotton, groundnut, and all that. Similarly, where you have the mountains, the cold climate, less people will be there. It's difficult. Where you have the Thar desert, less people will live. But where you have the western and eastern coastal plains, many more people will live. It's more fertile. Similarly, in the northeast, which is remote, where you have a difficult terrain, which is completely forested in some areas, and it is difficult to have a connectivity and communication with the mainstream society, less people will live. But where there is a better climate, better rivers, good mountains, the slope of the mountains, better agriculture is happening, more mining is possible because of rich minerals, maximum population concentration takes place, and this is exactly the summary of the ecological approach towards urbanization. That cities always grow surrounding environment and ecosystem. If you have things like river, natural resources, good trading routes, majority people will come and reside here. Similarly, under this, you have the concentric zone model. It's a very easy model to understand. You can actually highlight this if at all you get a question on What is the ecological approach towards understanding urbanization? Or you can also get a direct question. Do cities grow in response to ecological factors? Now, that's a quite viable question that can come tomorrow in the exam. So do remember here you absolutely need to mention about the same thing that we discussed, that wherever you have better topography, climate, and mineral concentration, majority people live, and there is a high density of population. Both these being fundamentals of urban place. High population, high density of population. Okay. Now you can also highlight the concentric zone model here. Now this again is also known as the Burgess model because it's given by this person. And it was created by him back in 1925, okay, when sociology was still germinating in most parts of the world. Now, he explains the model as a wherever there is a factory associated, wherever industrial activity is taking place, naturally people will come and start living there. So there will be workers who will live immediately near the factory. Apart from that, there will be other more elite segment of working population, the rich and the upper class, who will also reside in the periphery. Beyond that, you will have a zone of transition, again, the rural urban contiguum, and eventually you will have the commuter zone from where people will go inside and work in the factories. So everything is linked to each other. He also creates an onion kind of model, which is talking about the layers in which urbanization takes place. Naturally, if industrialization will be there, where will it be there? Wherever there is maximum natural resource. So ecology will decide industry. Industry will decide residence, where people live. Residents will decide what kind of means of transport and communication exist. So that's the kind of layered model that he creates here. But not only the Western thinkers, but even the Indian thinkers have a lot to say about urbanization. For example, the famous thinker M.S.A. Rao back in 1970s talks about urbanization as a totalistic and a very holistic approach. He says that it is not good to believe that urbanization always happens when people come from rural segment and they settle in the urban community. He also says urbanization always doesn't happen in the same direction. It does not always follow industry. There is a different way also. There are many larger and other social institutions which also impact urbanization. For example, religious tourism could be an interesting factor as an example. You know that wherever you have the cultural and religious sites, many people come and start living. Why? Because they are important sites as such. They appeal to people's spiritual self. So many people will come and live there. And since the density of population become high, automatically it gets converted into an urban area. There will be better infrastructure tomorrow. Similarly, if you have a traditional craft or occupation being practiced at one place, like in India today also, a lot of people were working, say, in the bangle making industry or in the textile industry, or they could be working in the ceramic industry. A lot of population comes and gets settled there because these are hereditary occupations and entire villages are doing the same job. You could talk about the Bandhani art, you could talk about the Kalamkari concentration zones where people are carrying on the same work and craftsmanship. Now, here also to practice the same occupation, some income, and from the point of view of your tradition, many more people will come and settle. Again, it leads to an expansion of population when generations stay there. It also tomorrow attracts tourists and more tourism in terms of cultural tourism. So again, these become urbanized eventually. So many more ways can lead to urbanization, not only industry and not only migration. Sometimes people collect in one place and that leads to urbanization. So he says that yes, it is a very, very heterogeneous process, but there can be multiple complex variety of urbanizations, not necessarily the same kind of urbanization. He also believes that only because urbanization is happening, it doesn't mean that completely institutions of caste and kinship are changing. That's not true. Sometimes, despite being in urban areas, people do continue with the same kind of caste ties, caste beliefs. Now, you can have modern examples like caste formation associations in politics. We can have examples of vote bank politics. We can have examples of caste associations to highlight the point further, to prove his point. Then he also says that family ties are also equally important for urban dwellers. A very good example would be that the latest NFHS study reveals that in urban India after COVID pandemic, the number of joint families are increasing instead of decreasing. And more than joint, you have the extended families now. So people in urban areas are also preferring living together rather than living in separate nuclear families. That's a changing trend. In fact, in rural India, joint families are coming down because of lack of money. But in urban areas, due to need for social security and expensive lifestyle, people are preferring to stay together and share their assets. So that's something that again proves his theory. Similarly, he also believes that urbanization and westernization are very different concepts, something we already spoke about. Westernization may or may not lead to urbanization. And he also says urbanization can be very different kinds. It could be post-industrial society, pre-industrial society, Western society, a complete traditional non-Western society. Now, why can't we talk about the South Korean and Japanese society? People there absolutely shy away from westernization. They are very modern, they are very industrial, they are very, very technologically superior. But they do not believe in a lot of Western ideas. They still like being in their own families, they still eat their traditional cuisine, they still carry their culture and language with pride. They aren't Western. They do not believe in the colonial legacy. So, therefore, despite being non-Western, they are highly urban and highly modern. Again, it proves the point of the theory. And he says urbanization can be seen through different aspects. It could be the administrative change, which means more democratic, more representative government. It could be commercial, religious, educational. Similarly, we have Ashish Bose's approach. It says something different from the previous approach of Professor M.S. Rao, because he completely believes in demographic transition or change. He believes whenever the population of a certain place expands too much, it corresponds with urbanization. This is not necessarily related to industrialization because urbanization will always not follow industrial path, something similar to what the previous theory was also saying. And he also says that urbanization is not a process where you can say it has happened and today it has stopped. Why? Because it is an ongoing and it's a continuous process. It will continue until there is over urbanization. He therefore talks about certain variables which impact urbanization or urban growth. These are the ratio between newly created towns to the total urban population. He talks about the declassified towns among these. He also mentions how some towns are breaking down and declining in number, and again a ratio where towns are rapidly increasing vis-a-vis the total urban population. So around these variables, he has really built his theory. Now, if we see the broad historical evolution of Indian urbanization, we can actually break it down into certain or 5 phases as such, and these are the prehistoric period, the early historic period, the medieval period, the British or the colonial period corresponding to 1800 to until India's independence, and then of course the post-independence Indian urbanization. Now talking about the prehistoric or the very early phase, we absolutely refer to the 2350 BC Indus Valley civilization. You must have read in detail about how well was the urban planning laid out here. The roads crossed each other at right angles. There was a separate drainage in every house which connected to the main drainage, main holes at regular intervals, proper water administration, every house having its own well, society being divided into the upper town and the lower town, granaries for storing the extra grains, and proper storm water drainage, something that even modern civilizations are trying to work towards. So, which means we talk about this extremely urbanized civilization with which our entire Indian civilization had actually started, which then came to an end, of course, in 1500 BC when we had the early Vedic period or the incoming of Aryans. Now, initially, when Aryans existed in Indian society, they lived in a very, very clan based society, which means many families would live together in a group or in a small village. Ties among each other were very simple, they were very, very informal, and they practiced some kind of cultivation, but it was not extensive agriculture. Slowly, with time, things changed, and then as we transcended into the later Vedic period, somewhere around 600 BC, when the early Vedic period came to an end after the 1500 BC, we talk about more expansive agriculture, we talk about new towns being created, and villages are also now changing from a clan-based living to more elaborate division of labor. We also talk about the beginning of the Varna system or the beginning of the caste system, which would also determine the profession of an individual. So societies were now coming to deal with a new kind of division of labor as such. So we had the Mahajanpad period where we had the big towns of Patliputra, Kannauj, Vaishali. They again had a very cosmopolitan culture where some kind of manufacturing with simple tools, craftsmanship, or artisans used to work. And we absolutely know that once the Brahmin superiority was too much to bear, and once society was marred by a lot of evils, including gender bias that came during the 600 BC period and onwards, in terms of patriarchy, in terms of caste biases, in terms of too much Brahminism, wars. So people then reverted towards peaceful religions of Jainism and Buddhism, which are also therefore sometimes known as the rebellion religions or reformative religions. Indian society was broadly also divided on racial lines, Aryans corresponding to the northern India, the original Indian inhabitants being referred to as the Dravidians of the peninsular India. Now, from this period, we have a constant history of ongoing urbanization for literally more than 2,500 years. Obviously, it happened in phases. This was also a war oriented, where one dynasty was taken over by another dynasty. So, which means the new towns were often destroyed only to be replaced by yet another new phase of towns. Now, when during the next period, India came under the influence of Mughal rule, it was a new Islamic culture that was meeting the native Indian subcultures. At the cultural front, while we had several issues of culture conflict, eventual culture assimilation, on the trade front as well, there were newer opportunities opening up for Indian artisans and manufacturers. Now, these Mughal courts became places where Indian manufacturers, cottage industry based artists, and other small goods and service creators, handicraft makers, textile makers, ornament makers, they started finding good opportunities of earning money in these schools. Often, Mughal emperors would encourage local native arts and crafts, which means that the trade guilds were getting now much more opportunity to shine and grow. Now, apart from impetus of trade activity, the new rulers also gave birth to a new kind of architecture. For example, Shah Jahanabad, the new city envisaged by Shah Jahan and his daughter near Old Delhi, became a very good example where the city was created in a way that in the middle of the city, at the core of the city was the emperor's palace, the temple, the mosque, the main bazaar. Towards the periphery, we had the houses of the common people, and towards the external periphery, we had smaller people, poor people, the low caste people who had actually settled down. So, in a way, the new forts, the new monuments, the constant need for expanding buildings and architecture also provided for much greater economic activity. Now, many people who could not find sustainable jobs in agriculture domain came into the cities and started participating in empire-related expansionist activities. For example, Fatehpur Sikri, Buland Darwaza. Similarly, gardens, forts, canals, waterways, roads, the Grand Trunk Road. All these are good examples of how empires expand and they work for more connectivity. So you see how more and more occupations keep on proliferating in society. The economic activity repeatedly becomes more urban centric rather than rural centric, which means again newer cities, newer urban centers taking birth like Agra, Delhi, Lucknow, Hyderabad. Now these became places which beheld emperor's powers, places where there was elaborate masonry required. Better Indo-Islamic forms of architecture came up. Better art and craft bazaars or huts were being constantly organized. Traders from outside communities, from outside societies would regularly come here for import-export. So you see how economic activity proliferated in the newer Mughal cities. Now, similarly, magnificent temples and temple cities of South India. I'm talking about the Vijayanagar Empire. We know that how elaborate was the waterway and canal system. The fact that city was created in layers of monument, every layer representing one activity, be it agriculture, be it water conservation, to residence, to trade. So you see how with better architecture, whether it be for religious purpose or whether it be for trade purpose, it again kept on giving impetus to urbanization. Similarly, when the British made an advent into India, it was a very paradoxical process. To begin with, the British aimed at creating only port cities like Madras, Bombay, Calcutta. Why? Because their intention was to create an outlet for Indian raw material. Similarly, these ports would also act as an inlet of British manufactured goods that were then popularized into Indian local markets. But in the process, what they did was a very, regionally imbalanced urbanization. While the cities came up, but either they were the prominent port cities, or they came up only where British chose to develop their factories or fortresses. Only in these areas did they promote some kind of economic activity. Even the industrialization on which they were focusing was very limited. Either it was towards ship making or port cities, or it was regarding paper, cement, or brick manufacturing. Much later, they ventured into railways, telegraphs, and postways. But the problem was, in the process of exploiting Indian raw material and making us a market of British goods, Britishers actually ended up not industrializing India, but deindustrializing India. Now, when a country deindustrializes, a major problem that comes from here is that with deindustrialization, there is also a deurbanization because a majority of Indian manufacturers and artisans who had earlier found jobs in Mughal courts and at the courts of other emperors were now jobless. Firstly, because the British defeated and closed all the courts. And secondly, since now they were only focused on taking away raw material, there was hardly any domestic demand for these artisans and manufacturers, which means they stopped producing, manufacturing, and they went back to villages to do agriculture, which means there was a massive reverse migration that took place. With reverse migration back to villages, urbanization in India became very, very haphazard. On the one hand, was city declining. On the other hand, cities were only developing near British factories and port cities. So, which means that British overall neglected Indian industrialization and urbanization, and it was only a subset and a provider for the needs of industrial revolution back in Britain. Now, similarly, for administrative purposes, the fact that British needed good climatic areas, they needed places where land was good enough to start tea, coffee, and rubber plantation. They also exploited the Shivalik Himalayan ranges, where most of the Indian hill stations were established by the British. First, they expanded the area under cultivation. Second, they also made forest reserve areas to take away the rights of local tribals from entering the forests. The conflict between British and the Pahadias, the British and the Santals are very prominent Indian history examples. Similarly, the British then created post offices, good administrative machinery, local courts in all these hill cities. Civil lines and cantonments were created where only the British inhabitants and officers would live. So the kind of urbanization was not only haphazard, but it was also very, very divided on racial lines. For a majority of Indian masses, the only place they found was in the periphery of the cities or villages, while the main posh upmarket areas of the cities were all taken away by the British officers, their families, and their workers. Similarly, much later, we had industrial townships where steel and iron works started. For example, Jamshedpur, Asansol, and Dhanbad. So we can say that the history of Indian urbanization completely varied with a changing power structure at the center. While during the Mughal period, we can see an immediate impetus in manufacturing and urban development. As soon as the British came, we had a very mixed situation. It was, on the one hand, a very, very haphazard and faulty urbanization. On the other hand, the cities were hardly any democratic. Most of the cities were offshoot of British administrative needs. They were hardly representative of Indian native classes. In the last phase, we talk about what really happened after independence. We know that in the very first 5 year plan that was adopted, more importance was only given to agriculture, it being the mainstay of the economy. However, the second 5 year plan, which is also the economic constitution of India, a brainchild of Dr. Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahalanobis, these people together created a vision for Indian industrialization on the lines of giving importance only to basic industries, giving importance to planned economy, as well as giving importance to mixed economy, wherein private companies and public sectors could coexist. The government also maintained a strong hold on the market because India was a new economy and it was yet not prepared to face the global market on its own terms. The British had left a very bad legacy behind. So, therefore, they spoke of creating an economy that was supported by the government itself. Now, since sudden spike in industrialization takes place only after the beginning of the second 5 year plan, majority urbanization in India happened in this period because of rapid industrialization, because of slow impact from global cultures, because of the rapidly rising service sector, and much more migration from rural to urban Indian places. Now, in India, we talk about the very well laid out and well planned cities, one of them created by Lake Corbusier, Chandigarh, another the capital of Odisha, Bhubaneswar. Then, with new government, new administrative and economic needs, new state capitals came into being. There were much well laid out industrial towns, steel plants, mining stations, iron plants, and immediately we saw a super spike in urbanization because we know that industrialization will always lead to urbanization. Hence, with this importance from the Indian government on industries, there was a sudden expansion even in the corresponding urban population. But at the same time, along with massive urbanization, as we just discussed, since the British created a pattern that was very, very regional in nature, they only developed few cities on urban lines while neglected all the others. Hence, maximum growth and urbanization happened only in these few targeted cities. Even in terms of indigenous Indian industries, wherever the basic heavy industries were laid down, population was getting concentrated only in those areas. So, while the remaining areas remained to be backward, certain areas came up to be as administrative and economic hotspots. Similarly, alongside the new working class, we also had massive slum formation, which was happening on the periphery of the big cities. A problem of those people who were devastated because of declining agriculture, and yet they could not find any job in industries because of lack of education. So, therefore, these people became the urban immigrants and the urban poor in that period. For a much better and overall administrative convenience of Indian urban set, the government in 1992 introduced the 74th Amendment Act to start decentralizing of powers to towns and cities in the form of urban local bodies. And by the time we reached the 2011 census, the total urban population in India was literally 38 crore almost, while the percentile of urban population was 31, which still meant 70% people continue to be rural. However, from then to now, by the time we wait for the new upcoming census, we know that naturally the 70% has reduced in a big way. So today we can safely assume, and even some World Bank reports say the same, that the total urban percentage of population should easily be around 35 to 36%, but which still means the majority population in India happens to be rural or maybe suburban. Now, most urbanized states, as per the same census, were Goa and Mizoram as well as Tamil Nadu. Among the union territories, Delhi happened to be the most urbanized, with literally 97% of its population being urban. However, we still have certain low performing states in terms of urbanization, which are Bihar, Assam, Odisha, Himachal Pradesh. So, these are certain states where majority population still happens to be rural. Now, as per the census record, you can see the immediate rise in the urban population with every coming census, that is within a gap of 10 years. While in 1901, it was barely 12%, even less. In 2001, it was 28%, only to become literally 38.1 by the time we reached the 2011 census. And I'm sure in the next census, we would have crossed 45% easily. Now, the global average of urbanization is like 54.5%. Now, of this entire urban Indian population, it is distributed into census towns, statutory towns, and certain outgrowths. Majority population of urban India being in statutory towns, to be followed by census towns, and then ultimately to the outgrowths, whereas city coming outwards and acquiring the nearby rural areas.